Thank you for this opportunity to speak today, and I also wanted to begin by recognizing that we are on the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq, but you'll see the ways in which colonial stories tie into the larger stories that I'll be telling today. So as a start, I'd like to give you some of the framing concerns for the talk about decolonizing the past through relationships. And so the questions I would like to begin with is how can we begin to shift the ethics of the ways in which we do history? And these involve questions of forgetting and remembering and what we owe to the past, perhaps, when we take something from it. And do we have to give up something to study the past? And moreover, perhaps the question that's more relevant to the story I'll be telling today is how do you change a bad ending? So I'll talk about 3 connected stories, but there are 4 pictures here. The first picture at the top left is my great-grandmother, Alice Maud Clark. And the gentleman below her is Syed Hussain, my great-grandfather. They met while he was studying law in England. She was his second wife. He kept a Muslim wife at home, and he married Alice in England. And they moved to India, and then they had families there. And I'm a result of that colonial process. And so when I think about colonialism, I think a little bit about my own existence as well. The result of colonialism in my case was it made me possible. But the other connected issues that I would like to deal with as well are a story about a group of 10th to 12th century mystics and scholars that were writing a fantastic story about animals. And lastly, an African gray parrot named Alex. And hopefully, I'll connect all of these stories for you. As any good colonial subject, I'll start with the only English dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, and under the gaze of the Queen right there in the corner. Decolonization, in its most recent iteration, according to the OED, takes 2 forms. The first is about ending colonialism, and we can think about this as ending the colonialism over there, that we dismantle our ramparts and we return from a colonial experiment done over there. But the other problem of colonialism is the ways that it embeds itself in our society. So the second definition here is to free an institution, a sphere of activity from one of the cultural or social effects of colonization, to eliminate foreign or colonial influences. So that deals more with the colonization over here. As it was mentioned in my introduction, that I was the head of religion, colonialism, and post-colonialism at the American Academy of Religion, and I was so excited, and I went and told one of my friends who had this radio program in Toronto called Indigenous Waves, and she said, "What do you mean post-colonialism? I'm still living in a situation of colonization, and here you want to add a post to the front of it." And so that kind of thinking sort of revised the ways that I was approaching my own angle and my own approach to these questions. Oh, sorry about that. So what I'm dealing with here is a little bit about the politics of knowledge in history. Because we have a tendency to narrate history as progress. We naturally move from caves to living in condos. And these civilizational justifications of forward movement and the forward movement of history are often used to justify projects against both people and the environment. So we can think, for example, about the way that residential schools work. In the first generation, someone may show up to count the number of heads in your village, and you may think that's okay. We don't mind the person just counting the heads. But in the next generation, if they use that as the basis for taking your children and sticking them in residential schools, suddenly you may become very suspicious of every other person who shows up with a survey in your community. In addition, with the way that we deal with the environment, what Leanne Simpson, someone who was involved with the Idle No More movement, one of the elders involved with it, commented that the alternative to this approach of extractivism, where we reach into the past or we reach into the ground and rip out the things that we want, is a deep reciprocity. It's about respect. It's about responsibility. It's about relationships, and it's local. What she means is she's opposed to the style, the Enlightenment style of generating knowledge. Francis Bacon famously said that the way that we get stories out of nature, or we get information out of nature, is to tie her to her rack and torture her secrets out of her. So that model of education and that model of knowledge gathering was the one that I was explicitly trying to oppose. In addition, we would see this with Orientalism, where knowledge about the other, knowledge about Africa, knowledge about Asia, was taken for the purpose of dominating those places, not for the purpose of making the people who live their lives better necessarily. So this is also implicated in the ways that we write history and what it might mean to decolonize it and how we get our data about it. So let's get to the specific case that I'm dealing with. And that is the case of the Brethren of Purity and Loyal Friends, the Ikhwan al-Safa, who were a group of Arab Muslim philosophers who lived in the 10th and 11th centuries in Basra, in what is modern-day Iraq. They're really fascinating because they're drawing upon a number of influences, such as Aristotle, Neoplatonic philosophy, the Quran. They even look further to the Panchatantra in India. They're drawing upon aspects of the Vedas and the Gita. So there's really savvy thinkers, and they're thinking broadly and ecumenically. The other thing that's kind of compelling about them is that they were a secret society. To this day, we still don't know who the members of this society were. Not to say that there hasn't been energy put into it, but we haven't had it confirmed in any meaningful way. But they would meet on a weekly basis, and they would pitch a topic or an idea, and then argue about it, and then take notes from those ideas and generate it into an epistle. And we have a number of these that have survived, but the epistle which I'm dealing with in particular, the 22nd one, I believe, is about the case of the animals versus human beings. And I'll get to that in a second. The other things that are compelling about them is that they were vegetarians, which is unusual in Islamic history. And in addition, they refer very explicitly to the reader of their texts as a brother, almost like they're inviting you into their community to study and learn with them. The text itself that I was working with was a translation by Len Goodman and Richard McGregor, and it was a parallel text translation with the Arabic on one side and the English on the other. So if you wanted to play with the languages, you could go back and forth between the two. And there's the citation if you find the talk compelling enough to go out and grab one. The story outline in brief is that the animals of the world sue human beings for abuse and take us to court in the kingdom of the jinn, under the king of the jinn, Biswarab. They realize that humans will not necessarily be fair in this lawsuit, so they call their representatives, and humans summon their representatives from all the different nations of the world, and the jinn will act as intermediaries and arbitrators. Now, the story is ultimately decided for humans, because the argument is that humans can be both devils and saints, and because we can aspire to be saints, we may be forgivable for the abuse we heap on animals. But this is a really unsatisfying ending, and I'll speak to that in a second. So the first party, and this is their theory of the case, this is exposing perhaps a bit of legal education on my part, is that the first party presents that the persistent state of injustice could never have been sanctioned by God. Human beings fundamentally misunderstand their place in the world and the chain of being. They charge that human beings simply don't have the authority. They're asking, under what claim of authority do you continue to dominate us, the animals? They argue that animals were never created for human utility. In fact, existed before humans, so it's not possible that they existed for human utility. Human beings need animals, but animals don't need human beings. And their backup strategy, because they're savvy legal operators, is that they will throw themselves at the mercy of the court. And here's an example of just such a presentation. It's that of the complaint of the ram. So the ram says, "You would have pitied us, your majesty, had you seen us as their prisoners, when they seized our smallest kids and lambs and tore them from their dams to steal our milk. They took our young and bound them hand and foot to be slaughtered, skinned, hungry, thirsty, bleeding for mercy but unpitied, screaming for help with none to aid them. We saw them slaughtered, flayed, dismembered, disemboweled, their heads, brains, and livers on butcher's blocks to be cut up with great knives and boiled in cauldrons or roasted in an oven. While we kept silent, not weeping or complaining, for even if we had wept, they would not have pitied us. Where then is their mercy? And this is a damning condemnation from over 1,000 years ago. And oddly enough, that condemnation resonated with a lot of the animal ethics literature that I was reading in the modern period as well. So the second group in this lawsuit are the humans themselves, and these are their defenses. If humans are superior, they should have a right to enslave animals, because at the time, they were already enslaving human beings. So if human beings can enslave human beings, the enslaving of animals shouldn't be any different. Moreover, animals lack legal standing. They're designated as subordinate to human beings by God. This is a theory of human exceptionalism. So the issue lacks justiciability. There's no case to be had here. In addition, they will say that they could ultimately win through force. So even if the court votes against them, they'll just kill all the animals and the jinn as well, and they'll win. And their backup strategy is to not only make the best arguments, but they also try to bribe the court. And the last party is that of the jinn themselves. And this is what's kind of interesting about this lawsuit, is it's not about the adversarial system like we have in Canada and the US, where two parties fight it out to determine who's right. But rather in this case, the jinn were themselves representatives of justice who arbitrated between the two parties, arguing that maybe justice should have a say in the outcome as well. And this stressed that the text itself was deeply concerned with a just outcome, which is why I was having so much trouble with the crappy ending. So the jinn are tasked with resolving the dispute, and they advised independently on the side of justice, but they're also conscious that they're dealing with bad operators in the human beings. The human beings could kill them. So the scholarship on this text, in that first extractivist mode that I was talking about, tended to classify this fantastic story about this lawsuit as merely another one of the fantastic fables of the East, something like the Arabian Nights. And their obsession was trying to expose and uncover who these anonymous authors were, despite the fact that the authors explicitly did not want their identity known, and voiced that a few times in the text too, that they wanted deliberately not to expose their identity. So the attempt by scholars to then expose it felt cruel, and felt also that it was against the intentions of the writers. Moreover, nothing could necessarily be gained. Nothing probative would be gained by discovering if it was one clerk or another one, or a philosopher named Abbas or a philosopher named Muhammad. The second phase, and the phase that we've entered into now with modern scholarship, is to seek out secret or other readings. This deals more with the idea and history of the horizon, that we're trying to appreciate what their worldview might have been like. And in that sense, the scholar Godfred Decolonizing offers very interesting assessments based on Ismaili theological ideas, which are a subgroup of Islam, and they construct history in terms of 1,000-year cycles. And he read this analysis into the text. And that analysis is brilliant, it's critical, it's deep, it's profound. But yet, it was not dealing with this fundamental problem that I had. This is a community of justice who's written an unjust story. What's going on here? So, for me, I ran into a moment of some serendipity when I was thinking about this story. And it was, of course, through a YouTube video. And it was a video about a parrot named Alex. And even his name wasn't his name. It was constructed through avian language experiment. And he was a 30-year subject, a 30-year language subject kept in a lab for that period of time. And he was brought out to do language tests and experiment, and it advanced our understanding of avian understanding and concepts and language a great deal. But one thing that happened, every time a news crew came in, whether it was National Geographic or Nova or whomever, Alex would always begin saying to the news crew, I want to go back. I want to go back. I don't want to be here. I want to go back. And the scientists doing the experiments with him just kept ignoring him and kept putting him through the next test. And I was looking at this, and it kept disturbing me more. I was like, we have taught this animal the extraordinary ability to speak to humans in our own language. And here the animal is telling us, put me back, I'm tired of this, and we were ignoring him. And so I thought, maybe that's another way for me to start listening to the text differently. Because the text is saying, the ram is saying, for example, if I kept silent, and if I no longer keep silent, will you hear me? Will you start to listen? And this made me think of something Franz Kafka once said, is he looked at a fish in a restaurant in which he was dining, and he had stopped eating meat. And when he looked at the fish, he said, now that I no longer eat you, I can finally see you. And I thought that was a kind of a profound statement as well. It gave us a depth of understanding about how we have to change our relationship to the other to maybe begin to see the other in a more meaningful way. So I started an experiment in method about how to keep reading this text and rereading this text, and I read it about 15 to 20 times, and I kept rereading it and kept coming back to it, and I attempted an experiment in method. So step one, maybe the fact that they read and created the text communally meant that I should read the text communally. So I built my own brethren, consisting of my partner, Aaron Luther, who is a specialist on animal ethics, and our children, who contributed as they chose. Maggie Abdul Masih, my colleague sitting right there, who had the language competency to help me extract the text, because my early Arabic is not good, nor is my modern. And she also knew mystic philosophy and understood Neoplatonic philosophy. And also, she's a true friend, and our souls resonate when we're working together. So the last step was I took a dietary shift too. I ate meat, and I decided to give it up for the purposes of an experiment if I could see the text differently. And I knew that it wouldn't be a short-term experiment. It had to be long. It had to be at least a year for it to make sense. Step two was to try and seek a deeper reading that made the ending of the book resonate with a sense of justice that made sense. And moreover, had me ask questions about how we go about listening to others and hearing them. And so the relationships that I cultivated, what I learned was that ultimately the affective shift that took place in me and my realization that the ending of the text was unjust unless it affected a change in the reader, i.e. me, I realized that I had to change my position. I had to do what the text was telling me to do to understand the text properly. And that was the only way that I could change the unjust ending of the text, was by doing exactly what the text was telling me, to move from a devil to a saint, to make that decision to move towards sainthood and away from being a devil. And in this particular case, if an animal over 1,000 years ago can voice the same abusive complaints that an animal today could voice, maybe hearing them is the problem. Maybe listening to them is the problem. And so my own affective shift changed the ending of the text for me. It now reads differently. It is now the text that resulted in a transformation, and it is about a relationship that I cultivated with the text, as opposed to merely reading it, merely mining it for data that would have been useful for a study or a paper for me. And that's it. Thank you very much.